Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Eve Castle, National Business Development Manager at Brickworks, and wherever you are watching from, we thank you for joining us. In the spirit of reconciliation, Brickworks acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we are gathered. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. At Brickworks, we aim to provide a platform for sharing ideas and discussions surrounding architecture and design. Throughout the year, we will continue to bring you diverse events online as well as in person hosted in our design studios throughout Australia and North America. We are very pleased to welcome Edition Office to share their work this evening. Both Kim Bridgland and Aaron Roberts have been very generous taking time out of the office and preparing for this event. Our long-term collaborator, Stephen Barrity, will be hosting the event tonight and guiding the conversation. Stephen is an architect, writer and educator and has prepared a Q&A session at the conclusion of Kim and Aaron's presentation. Earlier in March, we released a suite of new products in our B23 campaign, all of which deliver on our promise of creating beautiful products that last forever. But beyond offering trusted performance and longevity, many of these new products are made more efficiently with consideration of the natural resources employed and how these perform in our climate. Our new products include more options for light-coloured roof tiles, where thermal mass and reduced solar absorbance create cooler roofs and lessen the urban heat island effect. We've released a new range from GB Masonry, which incorporates 17% recycled material, and HydroPave is a new permeable paving solution from Urban Stone, which can assist with mitigation of flooding events. We've also extended our range of finishes available from Daniel Robertson with the Civic Series. Daniel Robertson was the first brick brand in Australia to achieve climate active carbon neutral certification across the full collection, and we are happy to report that this year marks the 10-year anniversary of that milestone. Before we kick off in detail with Edition Office, please take a look at some of these beautiful and thoughtfully made new materials.
Thank you, Eve, and thank you to Brickworks for their continued support of architecture. It's a pleasure to be back in 2023 for our inDETAIL talk series. Edition Office is an architecture studio encompassing cultural, social and technological research, enabling the exploration of material expression, form and spatial practice. The experiential qualities of their work enables projects which re-articulate relationships between communities and place. Their buildings enhance and enable connections and interfaces which provoke, question and enrich both occupants and the public realm. Edition Office work across a wide variety of typologies and scale, including residential, institutional, commercial, education, urban design and interiors. Across that range of typologies and scale, they have maintained their careful consideration of place, use, materiality, and experience. Each project sensitively crafted to respond to their specific conditions. We are extremely fortunate today to have both founding directors to present for us. You will get to witness their strong working relationship through this presentation of their work. I now welcome Aaron Roberts and Kim Bridgland of Edition Office. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, here in Mianjin on Turrbal country. Aaron and I are going to take you through, I guess, some of my thinking on a range of our projects. We'll take you through some methods. For our country, the inaugural National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial, designed with Gangalu and Kudjula man Daniel Boyd, the primary interface, the element of the project that you first encounter is a 10 metre wide, 3 metre high, two-way mirror glass screen. And its intention is to be, I guess, a zero-dimensionally thick surface, a portal through which to, see elsewhere, be in place and observe a time and a place which is foreign, a way to see into cultural relationships with who you might be in terms of sacrifice of Indigenous service or sacrifice from the colonial histories of this country, how to interpret or engage with the other. Our Mossy Point House, something that we focus on a lot is, I guess, the tautness of the skins of our projects, having the persona and presence of them defined relative to their external conditions, relative to their landscapes. And the intention of this is to have a heightened sense of the definition of or relationship between the house and its landscape, so there can be a dialogue emerging between them, but also to heighten the sense of threshold into the interiority, that soft sanctuary space. The entrance to our Mossy Point house is the outside fulcrum of a pierced void through the centre of that house, defining a split edge on that with that southern light interface between social and private in the home. Our Napier Street apartments, this is a rapidly gentrifying area in Fitzroy in Melbourne. Working class cottages line the opposite side of the street. The site that our project was on was one of many factory fabrication machinery workshops, good century and more ago. The interface to the street references and speaks to the bullnose verandas, that ironwork, that lace work of metalwork and pride and delicacy and detail presenting to the street, enabling the porch, but inverted, flipping upside down as it rises up the facade. The slabs and party walls of the project are consciously single story, setting one home row by row vertically up the street in the same manner as the worker cottages across the street line themselves repetitiously, horizontally. The edge of our Mary Street house. This house is open to three sides. There's a broad side opening to the north, which is also opening to a busy arterial road. That defensive sheltering gesture of that, the wall that becomes the fence wrapping around the side boundary, allows that buffer of interiority relative to the exposed public domain, but also consciously starts collaging the street to the wall, to the heritage existing house, to the private principal bedroom, and then to the fabric of the Victorian terraces and the lemon centre behind. The street edge of cultural buildings, our concept and master plan for the Bendigo Art Gallery. The original entrance is that small mouse hole, the red brick space in between that was innocuous and set back. Asking ourselves questions of how to bring forward, I guess, a civic gesture, speak to the street, draw you through to the national park or the botanical gardens behind, and then set up a civic square, a public square, and rotate the entrance, cleaving in or unfolding in from the side. Part of the design of that project is that cultural edge, having the awareness that we're non-Indigenous practitioners. We work on country. This is on the Dja Dja Wurrung country, and going through the design process, with consultation and conversation with the community and the Dja Dja Wurrung traditional owners, bringing forward the awareness or the triggering of colonnades, of columns, having that civic frontage of facades, and the power of directionality in the previous concept design. It asks the question of letting go of concepts that you might hold dear and reframe them. In this case, having a building approached from all around, from all sides, with a woven, finer grain forest that allowed both people, light and landscape to flow and cross the boundaries and the threshold of that gallery space.
When we talk about shroud, we suggest a sort of performative outer skin which wraps the building with varying degrees of permeability. It's a filter to the surrounds, augmenting and adjusting the building's relationship to context, people and environmental conditions, while defining the limit of the architecture. It also supports these interstitial spaces between context building and building proper. So for the Federal House, the vertical timber shroud acts in a multitude of ways, holding that interstitial space between more highly controlled interior spaces and the almost traditional veranda. It holds shadow here, grading light before giving away to the warmer interior spaces. It defines an inner sanctuary within the broader context of that wonderful hinterland up in Byron Bay. It opens and gives way to frame and hold both distant views across the hinterland and its skyline, alongside more intimate and direct connections to the immediate landscape. The Hawthorne House utilises the shroud in a more opaque or solid way, using the gesture to control views from the interior as a horizontal projection out to the context in the surrounding garden, calming the noise of the surrounding suburb, while at the same time countering or defying the massiveness, the perceived weight of its concrete skin, touching down in a more animated gesture around its perimeter. It holds and creates intimacy within an otherwise incredibly open ground plane, which was when we conceived of that, was seen as a sort of singular garden platform. And to the upper level, it allows privacy and carefully framed sky and canopy to the surrounding established trees. We're working on a project in Sydney in Central Place, and in this instance, the shroud allows for a more singular formal expression and acts as this sort of interstitial space between the public and private realm, becomes this welcoming space where one enters or is embraced by the building without being inside proper. And I guess in some ways you saw a bit of that happening with the Bendigo Art Gallery as well. And we see it as encouraging this social layering and habitation of the edge of the outside edge of the building, and breaking down that delineation between the private and public, with the programmatic potential of this space acting as a semi-public fulcrum between industry, research and commerce. Alongside this, it performs as a solar shade across the entire building while allowing views of the city through the bronze mesh from the inside. And in a similar sort of way, we did a competition down in Hobart, which we weren't successful in, unfortunately, but it uses a method in a similar way, albeit sort of hoping to contain and amplify a hidden world within a merging of the natural with the digital and technological research that's happening within the building. The ceramic facade captures and holds a campus like interior. So in some ways it was a sort of a really open and connected workplace, where the lower level street edge, utilising an operable mesh curtain, allows that flexibility of becoming private or public in event mode. During the day, the upper levels appear more opaque, while at night the building reveals an alternate character, allowing glimpses of the internal workings and the forest within.
The void cut through the central axis of our NGV pavilion design with Nukunu and Kokatha Woman, Ioani Scarce. It's a negative cut through a cylindrical hole, representing the loss of language and life and culture of Indigenous, the First Nations, peoples of this country, all through the laws and policies, through the false absence of terra nullius. The centre of For Our Country, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial and Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, is a receptacle, a vessel. The thinking that we went through with Dan was how to make this site that was on one country, how can it be a safe place and belong to all? This receptacle goes 4 metres down into the ground. This is open in ceremony, through a ceremony event, otherwise it's sealed, allowing earth and sand and soil and from countries all across Australia and Torres Strait to belong here, to be a part of this place. That tech campus in Hobart, a void through the centre of this large building having an inward-facing aspect, cafe, pastries on the right, breakfast, lunch and dinner served on the buffet to the left. The social space, the social heart of this campus wrapped around, I guess, a framed forest floor aspect from the Tasmanian landscape, bringing that ecology within the centre of the building, but purposefully rising up that shift to soft light, the cognitive restoration, the affect and balance from a day staring at a screen on digital computation. That void peers through the centre, the roofline and the body of our Mossy Point House, splitting the social and private spaces in half, allows a recess on the long northern porch of that building to pull back. It's something that we are aware of in a lot of projects that have fall on the site. The living platform in this project is elevated, looking across the landscape but not touching it, and making sure we have a sense of intimate green space, intimate living space within the confines of the floor plate is critical. We also allow southern light or northern light and southern light to bounce back into this void, framing the underside of the spotted gum canopies, framing the night sky and stars of an evening.
Moving to the back to the Napier Street apartments on the left. It's a below ground volume which was carved out and aligned to the street edge, which links to and in some ways inverts the void space in our Hawthorn project, creating sanctuary in an otherwise very public interface within the street. In our experience, certain projects require a reduction in material types to more clearly define a volume, and in Mossy Point and in the studio at the Art Bank, these are examples which collect and hold volume by utilising one holistic material, where multiple materials may reduce the clarity of reading of that volume, and in this case, the pronunciation of the taller volumes. And similarly, in our Point Lonsdale house, it celebrates a lift in volume as the key main space for the family holiday home, defined by the rich, warm timber lifting over the ceiling as that space where the family come together and reunite. And returning to that campus competition in Tasmania and to the social and community space as the organisational heart of the campus, which was defined in volume and character by the stepped theatre space above, the almost hive mind of the company and its intellectual pursuit, linking together with what we felt as two of the most important parts of the project, the intellectual and the social, volumetrically allowing one to affect the other. A house in Box Hill, which uses volume to define program and give it presence as a way of breaking down a more universal open space into finer grain volumes. And in this instance, defined by the volumes created by the roof pitches rather than just the walls alone. And in absence at the NGV, and I think this is one of the most important images of this work we did with Ioannis Gas. And really what we're saying here is defining volume for dialogue, of sitting in a space that is equal and mirrored, the twin seats looking from one space to the other, equal and balanced pairs looking from one to the other, an incredibly introspective space, pulled away from context, with volumes that draw one upward to sky, and universal phenomenological connections to place, history and time. We see that as a place to listen to country as well as each other.
For Our Country, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial, it's sits within the context of the Australian War Memorial, which culturally for a lot of people is an unsafe cultural space for First Nations community. The work exists as a safe island within that site, a relational figure back to the trees that are taken from conflicts from around the world, or conflict sites that Australian armed service persons have fought within. And ducks peels back, pushing back or leaning into the protection of those. The mirrored face of the memorial, when seen from the other side, repeats the two oak trees behind and blends or holds the project within that wall of trees, informing or influencing or suggesting the conflict site on this turf, on this country of Australia, another Australian conflict site. The island of our federal house up in the northern, down in the northern rivers from this location, consciously an island within its landscape site, and consciously an island from which to gaze upon it back onto that prospect and that the moving weather of that horizon, the shifting qualities of light. An apartment building of ours, Fenwick in Kew. This sits up on the riverbank, sits up on the escarpment, overlooking the river, the Birrarung, the Yarra River in Melbourne, looking to the north over Richmond and the northern suburbs. This site exists both in a place of rich natural importance and steep topography falling down to that cliffside of escarpment, but it also sits in a landscape full of extraordinary architectural heritage. Having a large or a brief for a large apartment building, a multi-residential building, the first gesture was to splinter it, to atomise it into three distinct parts, three islands on the site, allowing that entropic growth of garden of the landscape of the street to flow through and connect to the river, and open from the public realm the views and connection to the vista into the northern light. The Box Hill House. An island in its own right, a house again with a taut skin, a taut fabric, an identifiable persona for the form and character of the house. But an island within an island. This is a multi-generational house. On two corners, the elderly parents. On the other corners, our clients, the primary or the parents of the home, intertwined with multiple social spaces. With an inward focus, this landscape will rise up with a number of trees that are now planted in this site, allowing the family to have a social sanctuary for the three generations living here, rotating and moving around. The back corner on the back and left side of the screen is a bench seat tucked into one corner of the site, allowing northern sun opening into a private living space and social space behind. The island in a curatorial discussion or a curatorial framework. Image on the left is an exhibition we designed and co-curated with Trent Jansen. It brings the artworks off the wall in dialogue with design items, so artworks from the Art Bank collection, and bringing them both in the round as a cultural artefact, the A face of an artwork or a canvas presented in the round with its B-side, with the curatorial data and name tags to be understood as a whole piece. Gertrude Contemporary on the right, the gallery within the shopfront space. This is a design that takes a lead from the lineage of Gertrude Contemporary being a squatting shopfront space in Gertrude Street in Fitzroy, which was iconically known for the 20 odd years it was in that space, for that streetscape lens, that I guess that connection of art and exhibition to the happenings on the footpath outside. Here it's treating the object or the container, the curatorial container is the object as much as the art and the dialogue that happens in front and around it. The two islands. This is taking again, there's an etymology, there's a lineage from our Hawthorne house of having elevated spaces that exist in the public realm as formal gestures. This is a house that formally drops down and is framed between two large and stunningly beautiful red brick end silhouette facades of Victorian terraces. allowing there to be a formal dialogue between that interrelationship of the urban fabric of its surroundings, but also creating two release spaces or intellectual or emotional sanctuaries within the house, a studio and the principal bedroom, and having a space which is other and elsewhere, both from the street out, over the that protective sheltering boundary wall, but also from the social lives of a busy family with 3 boys, having a principal bedroom up with its own private courtyard, its own immersive, I guess, immersion within that rich spotted gum plywood timbers.
This idea of grounding happens quite a bit in many of the projects, and in the instance of the Federal House, we saw it as a way of, I guess, holding this flightless, listless thing that landed on the site and yet is inherently grounded and takes one literally underground within the pool space and into soil. It's this anchoring device. It's emotionally calming and is also thermally, a kind of way of balancing and making that space consistent. The War Memorial, in a similar way, we saw as an emotionally grounding space. Visiting the memorial can be, a very charged and challenging emotional experience for some members of the community, and the project aims to ground and hold visitors in this calm and introspective space behind the wonderful lenses of Daniel Boyd's artwork. The Fenwick Street project, which was the apartment project, it sits right on the edge of an escarpment looking out over the Birralong and the valley beyond, and this edge feels quite precarious. But now in the heart of the project, between the 3 key pavilions, one has this sense of being incredibly grounded, and we designed this landscape in collaboration with Eckersley Garden Architecture, and allow this ability for the building to be gradually subsumed by the landscape, subsumed or consumed, with the hope of becoming, I guess, inherently part of the ground, a kind of relic in place. And back to the Box Hill house, through the relationship with our client, we grew to understand that the family had come here as refugees, and one of the roles the house needed to perform was a way of permanently anchoring the home and this multi-generational home to place. And it begins anew the linking of family lineage to home. The project was made out of something solid, permanent, robust, everlasting brick. We allowed the brick to completely cover all external surfaces, including the roof, to give weight and presence to the building and ultimately amplify this notion of being fixed and heavy and anchored. And the master plan for Bendigo Art Gallery, again, through the design process, we wanted to acknowledge the heritage of the gold mining town alongside Indigenous histories, and through discussion with the local Indigenous community, we grew to understand that this place was known as upside down country. That being the subterranean turned outward and brought to the surface through the gold rush. And we wanted to consider the value of earth and in this instance, its identity, elevating and celebrating the material as an incredibly important component to country, to being a material which nourishes and gives life to country, and to allow country's identity to fall across the surface of the building. And in this instance, we draw ground up and into the building through an earthen facade system.
Shadow. I think we can't be architects without standing on the shoulders of Junichiro Tanizaki. The Melbourneian apartment, this is an interior fit-out we did for a home a number of years ago. Coming across or beginning that project, we were given an apartment space with an overabundance of light, an absolute saturation of daylight. And one of the tasks was to give it graduation, to give it shape, to give it quality. conceiving a series of rounded, curved, pod-like structures, a building or a residence with no doors, defining social spaces, kitchen spaces, utility spaces, sleeping spaces, study spaces from this sequence of singular curved elements that allowed a gradation of light to shadow, back to light again as you move through the project. Distilling that same method or that same level of thinking with our Box Hill house is actually as you pinwheel, as you circulate around this interior courtyard, moving away from curves and consciously moving into sharp square corners where shadow can coalesce and condense, and we can celebrate the denseness of those as we move around a series of framed social spaces, each of them naturally lit from the connection to that inner courtyard, and allowing the slow spaces, the distillation or the definition between those spaces to leak and to bleed out in that shadowy between. And a variation on the theme with our Mossy Point house, moving from square corners to shaped faceted corners to allow light to wash across a flat surface. The image on the left, again, that fulcrum joint at the centre of the house, allowing that band of southern light to bleed in and softly wash across both sides. This one of the two twin or mirrored studies of the house with the northern aspect looking back to the Tomaga River here in Yuin country, and having that intellectual space of writing and reading held under that ceiling, that coffered or that vaulted ceiling of quietly darkening shadowy light above. Our Art Bank studio, so this was an office, it was an artist studio, and the central heart of this project was holding the archive. This is Art Bank as a federal Australian government initiative that for I think 40 odd years now has been collecting and holding contemporary art, so contemporary thought, leasing that out, giving it life. And when those artworks they're leased out to residences, to commercial spaces, they need rest. The physical artifact of these artworks need rest from natural daylight, from sun, to recover and to maintain. Our intention was to make sure this rest happened as a collected body of thought, of intellectual might, of 40 years of Australian creativity. And vanguard of thinking, as a figure to walk around with and understand as a whole. And shadow as a balm, shadow as a cultural and intellectual balm. Shadow as black space, B-L-A-K, black space, under the magnificent garland of Ioane Scarce's black yams. A space to slow down and to allow the fragility or the power of big ideas, of coming to grips or coming to terms with a traumatic or a divided history of this country. A space to linger in that moment, held by, I think, the magical gift, I think the profound generosity of Ioane's works and the vehicle or the medium that it is, allowing connection to sap, to ancestors, to spirits, to life, leading up to stars, drawing down to you. And then our federal house, the interior courtyard of our federal house, is a topography falling down from the living platform down to that subterranean pool, learning from the landscape, the Minion Falls, that surrounding area, or the valley floor of Minion Falls, and feeling the noticeable, sharp, distinct temperature change as we fall into that valley floor. If we move to spaces shielded from direct sunlight, allowing a thermal anchor, a cooling thermal anchor from that cool body of natural water below to be the heart of the home, flowing up, rising up from that subterranean coolness, and having that, again, that sense of intimate touching of green landscape, of living landscape, and having that shadow fall down into that lower wet swimming space. And then the shadow and the light, and the definition of what you choose to see. Do you choose to see the shape of the light, or do you choose to see the shape of the shadow? One having a clear, in this project, an incredibly clear reference into the cultural and political power of race and culture, the negative spaces in our history, the negative spaces in our history books, which ones are giving shape and privileging and awareness of the other. This internal sanctuary space, the protected interior of our war memorial, the project is facing east, allowing the light of the morning sun every single day to shine into the space and fill it, and fill the occupants when they're there at that time with that starlight cloud of light, allowing that sense of, from the exterior, a space of reflection and a space of interpretation, of gazing through that portal, in having an emotional connection to country, to culture, to sacrifice, to loss. And from the inside, having a space of intimacy. It was incredibly in the front of our minds for Daniel and ourselves that this project needed to hold a balance of a national story that needed to hold place for the weight of our history, for the weight of the frontier wars. And it needed to hold space for individual families, individual pieces, individual people who needed to come here and find their own meaning within this space and find their own sanctuary and connection to the loss that they personally, their family, their ancestors had suffered. And oscillating between the grand national narratives and the individual personal narratives, and making sure where one doesn't override the other, and making sure that this is again, I guess shadow is a balm. This can be a hugely emotionally overwhelming space, coming to terms with these stories, particularly for First Nations community, and making sure that the interior is in embrace. It's literally a rammed earth bench, a rammed earth wall, drawing up of the earth, wrapping around and holding a small enclosure in a small room for the needs of the individuals and communities, and how they need and choose to use that space.
So coming back to these two projects, I think we've been incredibly lucky to work on those projects, and I think that in relation to surface, we can't really talk about we can't not talk about them. And in absence is obviously imbuing surface with this cultural identity and narrative. And Ioane's work operates in so many different ways that, as Kim has sort of highlighted before, this sort of mercurial quality, that of referencing sap leaching out from generations of fires alive with histories, and the glass yams being seen as both the reference to the agriculture that was alive and well, and in that deep history, and also referencing individual spirits drawn from the surface. So it's really, I think it's an important kind of reference in relation to both this one and the work with Dan, but I think it can be read in a multitude of ways, and I think that's also part of the way that we approached both this project and Daniel's, the work with Daniel Boyd, allowing for multiple readings of those surfaces and not being didactic about how they're to be interpreted. With Daniel's remarkable artwork, it really created a surface which, again, Kim has mentioned this sort of portal or othering to the other side of the veil, and being equally here and now, both in terms of the immediate experience of it, and also referencing that sense of deep time as well. And this idea of decontextualizing and reframing the self through all those lenses. And its darkened surfaces and shaping light, which casts its duplicated surface over the bodies of those people sitting or moving within the memorial. And I'll never forget that day that we actually opened this, when the soldiers moved through it, and all the lenses and things were kind of falling across their bodies as they moved through the space. It was pretty special. Then I guess a different kind of surface, a more prosaic one, but Hawthorne House, it's a surface that gave, I guess, a finer grain to an otherwise severe formal expression. it sort of allowed texture and grain to create shadow across the surface, and which it then became the perimeter fence through the reuse of the concrete formwork of the boards of the concrete formwork onto the perimeter wall. And Mary Street, it's sort of it's utilising a low-grade, rough and tumbled recycled brick, which was an evolution of earlier experimentation, both from the Kyneton House, which was quite similar in terms of its the way it was employed, and before that the Fish Creek House, which was one of our earlier projects, which was a real celebration of mortar application, where the mortar creates texture and shadow and transforms the brick into a holistic continual materiality while celebrating and holding the individual variation of the recycled bricks. It's been a big journey on the surface treatments to bricks, and one which we're really interested in pursuing further. And then finally, the Fenwick project again, I guess grain on that monolithic concrete surface. But in this instance, I guess a focus on the copper screens, both materials which age and patina gracefully as the building is consumed by the landscape and the vegetation.
Yeah, I think most importantly, context. We as architects always exist within context. Everything we do is within context, both whether that be the context of the site, the cultural, the economic context that we live in. Every project of ours and the work and the spaces that we work within don't exist in a vacuum. They exist with people and the communities and spaces and the social fabric. The wrap-up projects, once they're completed, create relationships, create space for some, maybe close space for others. So it's incredibly important, and it has been important for us since the inception of our practice, is to try as much as possible, try and be aware of the context that we're working within. This was a speculative project for the Victorian markets in Melbourne. This is a space of rapid development on the, that northwestern corner of the CBD, the Hoddle Grid. A childcare centre perched up on a platform. Its form of which is taking on the lineage or the context of the Vic markets itself. That the robust efficiency of the prefabricated bolt together cast iron frames and trusses of that space. In this case, held on that platform, giving space, making sure there's a childcare centre with a huge amount of residential towers wrapping that site, but also enabling a scale shift, a sense of change from the rhythm of the concrete, the vaults below, which reference the rhythm and pace of meandering and moving through the markets that are immediately adjacent to this site, but allowing this building to have a subtle vertical rise from what we hope will be a landscape and a garden across the current bitumen car park, to this building rising up to the immediate sheer face on the south and east flanks of this site, to the tall residential towers that surround it. The spatial context, the cultural context on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country for our country. The hill in the top right of screen, or the right-hand side of the screen, for a long time, the Australian War Memorial had no presence of First Nations people. In fact, it had and has Australian flora and fauna and Aboriginal faces embossed or embedded in relief within the inner courtyards. So First Nations people existing physically on site, not as people, but as part of the landscape, part of the flora and fauna of site. A space for Indigenous diggers, First Nations diggers, to come and commemorate their loss and their service was on the top of that mountain on the right-hand side of screen. So on ceremonial spaces and commemoration spaces on the War Memorial site, they'd walk across the road and go to the community-owned or community-created War Memorial. It was very in the placement and location or siting for our country on the site, it was important that it embrace and look back to that community-made heritage for their own needs. The concept design for Bendigo Art Gallery, the city of Bendigo is divided into a sports precinct, there's a botanical gardens precinct, there's a cultural precinct, which is the street that we're looking at here, and then there's the city centre a few blocks away. This arts precinct is entirely cut off from the botanical gardens that are right behind this building. A key part of this concept is to breaking down that barrier, break down the rabbit warren of alts and adds and small manipulations and additions to the gallery that have made the interiors lost and aloof from its surrounding context, and allowing that visual draw and visual street, turning the foyer of this project to a space that someone can walk through simply to get to the other side and move through the city. So turning into a social and a street of the township itself, drawing the activity of, the arts district through the topography and up into the botanical gardens, and from that to the city centre itself. So holding context of two otherwise cut off and divided parts of the city fabric. The curatorial context again, so seeing the front side of that exhibition designed and curated with Trent Jansen. This was a series of artworks drawn from the Art Bank collection. The 2D works hold on those easels in the round within the space in dialogue with design pieces set in the foreground and set in direct relationship. So each design work was seen and encountered within the gallery space with a pure frame of reference of the artwork that it was associated with, creating narrative dialogues between the two that would emerge between the two works, the design piece and the artwork from the collection, with the third variable of that narrative dialogue between the audience itself, the witness between that relationship. That exhibition was very self-consciously designed or curated within the context of the archive that we had already designed there. So making sure that any body of new work, of contemporary work that was put on display in the exhibition space existed within the co-relational curatorial gaze or critical gaze of 40 years of contemporary Australian thought, allowing each to inform and critique and discuss and aesthetically chatter across the space to one another, allowing one to uphold the other, one to interrogate the other, and making sure that the frame of reference is always clear into the critical art space that people operated within here. And then the context of In Absence, the NGV pavilion with Ioane Scarce on the grounds and the gardens of the NGV. That project was designed with that void, that slice, that symmetrical slice through the centre of the project in precise relationship to the central axis of the Roy Grounds NGV building. But not just the building, the building as a signifier for the art, museum, cultural, industrial complex, and the past, or I guess the colonial past of ownership, of claiming, of taking of artifact from non-Western cultures and holding within their archives. So this body, this building exists within a series of contexts, both that of our national story and both with this as a curated, commissioned art piece within the context of that museum's past. Once inside the building, that context very consciously changes from a series of two pavilions enabling dialogue from one to the other, two equal spaces, not divided, not codified, two spaces for one for listening or for deep listening, one to the other, but consciously for framing a vertical view to sky country, leaving the city, the sounds behind, the urban nature of the NGV itself and the city of Melbourne that it exists within, and the short period of time, a short period of the present moment existing on country, under the big sky country, under that glorious garland of Ioane's yams. And that's us. That's our thinking. That's our works to date. And thanks so much for coming and hearing us.
Thank you both for your rich presentation of an impressive body of work. I was also impressed with your grouping of ideas underpinning multiple projects, so thank you. I see an incredible clarity of thought and design intent through your projects. The consistency is incredible, yet none of them look like each other. Hawthorne House does not predict Federal House, which does not predict Napier Street. There is, however, a very strong rigour towards the idea, materiality and detail in each project. How did you initially identify and develop your rigorous design approach? Was it immediate or a much slower process?
Good question. Thanks, David. Aaron and I had the opportunity when we began Edition Office. We'd been working together under another practice and got to be aware of a working manner together under that studio, and were very clear of how we wanted to do our work and how we wanted it to be engaged with, and how we wanted to engage with that design process for Edition Office. And part of that was, there's a pursuit of clarity in every project we do, and that's not out of vanity. That's out of, we hope, that in clarity of the form or the spaces, the definition of those, then there becomes a relationship to that. This, clarity of an interior space creates an awareness of light, an awareness of form, and then awareness of those landscape spaces below. The clarity and singularity of a form or the silhouette of a form can create grace or presence or relationship to that building. So starting with having designs that can be boiled down and pared back down to a rigorous diagram means that we've cleared away things that we don't think are absolutely primary and critical to that project, and allows it to to go through that design process and come out the other end as a built form. And the other half of that is communicating, or the communication between ourselves, but incredibly importantly to the client, making sure that there's a rationale, that we're not taking them through fanciful ideas or fanciful notions, again, for our own ego, for our own purposes, that the clarity in our design, we hope, has purpose for them, that there's an empathetic reason for the clarity and purpose for their social fabric, for their family, or whether it being a private residential house, or if it's a commercial or cultural project, there's a logic and rationale for paring that singularity down in the design outcome.
I guess I'd add that the presentation that we just gave really talks about the methods and tactics that we employ, and I think obviously a site is always different, client's always different, and those tactics kind of emerge and change the nature of any design because of the nature of those differences. And I think maybe the clarity is about how we respond, or the kind of methods that we respond through.
Following on from that, perhaps, how do you think that approach has evolved as the projects have changed in scale and typology?
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be practicing over a period of time. So I think, what are we, six and a half years now?
You say that like it's a long time. From my point of view, that's a long time, 6 years, my God.
To know which buttons to push harder and which ones to be less precious about, that's such a gift in terms of the evolution of just a process, what things to dive into deeper. I think what we hoped to show in I guess the cross-pollination of ideas, or it's talking about methods rather than project or typology or scale, is that it doesn't actually change, in terms of the scale. There is a learning. There's definitely a learning going from a single residential project or small cultural projects to large buildings, because they They do have different rules of engagement. To reach that same, hopeful endpoint that we get to, where there's a presence, where the building can be understood in its own right, there is a game of scale and language to get to that same point. But the pathway or the rationale of hoping to be so, for example, the commercial building for Central Place Sydney, that's in part of this extremely large tech hub, a stone's throw from Central Station in Sydney. Our project is a scale shift from the urban fabric of Sydney to this huge, multi-billion-dollar new development, which is going to be occurring behind it with a massive scale shift. So it needs, that project needed a presence as a figure in the round, and it needed a textural and material tactility that held that layering of those two spaces.
So having your list of methods and the richness of that or the breadth of those methods and your rigorous editing process allows you to scale up, allows you to follow through on your ideas, whether it's a smaller project or a larger one.
I think you get to test a whole lot of things at a small scale, and then you can understand how I guess with a project that may have less writing on it. Not necessarily always the case when it comes to, say, some of those small, important cultural projects that we engage with, but you do get to test some of those tactics and moves at a smaller scale, and then to ramp them up. And I think that that some of those things, particularly when you're talking about, say, the shroud or the outer kind of space where you are creating a kind of interstitial space. I think those sorts of things do really carry at scale and change, and I think that the veranda or those spaces that allow us to augment and adjust a building's relationship with environmental conditions in Australia, for instance, is a kind of old and tested scenario, and so scaling it up only makes sense. And I think in the case of Central Place Sydney, it really kind of provides that wonderful kind of layering of the building. So I think it's a bit of experimentation at that smaller scale, which allows us to understand things. And I think Kim and I were talking about this kind of idea earlier, actually. And I was sort of thinking about it as more of a one-way kind of trajectory, that being like a kind of smaller scale up to bigger scale. And he sort of mentioned that it's actually not that. It's like kind of dual. It's going back and forth. And so things that we're testing at scale now are kind of coming back and informing smaller scale works, which is pretty interesting when we're going through it all.
I think that's a testament to how disciplined you guys are. The work shows that. So congratulations. You touched on it before, but you've designed for many different clients with different desires and objectives, yet the rigor is consistent. How do you work with clients to achieve this?
It's a mentor of mine, when I had the fortune, and some of us do when we're students, when we're kind of emerging, and our understanding of what architecture is or could be is emerging in that very nascent stage. And his advice, I think I was a second year student at the time, was a really good architect, the most important skill they need is empathy. And they need to be able to hear a client and understand the context, and then they need to be able to communicate back to them those ideas. You can have the most extraordinary architectural design ideas, but if you can't prove that to your client, you won't build it. I was just talking to a couple of friends at the back of the audience. They're asking about the Mossy Point house, around that, I guess, that diamond void through the centre of the house. That was a low budget project, and there's only so many moves you can do. We needed to boil it down to one element that solved numerous problems, that being footprint, allowing circulation to be boiled down to an extremely small area that allowed you to move to private to social spaces, but allow them to have their separation. At the same time, allowing that breathing into that outside, fairly narrow, long northern outside deck, and actually create an outdoor room. And that one gesture both allowed us to push back against the formal familiarity we know from pitched ceiling spaces. We know them, those symmetrical kind of square ends. They're beautiful, but we're familiar with them, and it allowed us to make it that little bit more dissonant, and allow light to actually shear across those angled spaces. But at the entrance, that site has a view. It looks out to the north. It looks through these glorious vertical stands of spotted gum trees. There's a Tomaga River winding through. And we told them, you're going to walk in and see a blank wall, and and you're going to move around, and you're not going to have a direct side-to-side connection from your outdoor space to your living space. And it kind of, they were like, well, that's just wrong. I want a window right when I walk in the door. And it's, I think, similar to our Hawthorn house. The bedroom spaces there have no outlook beyond the site, but there's neighbours all around. You can't get quality outlook there. So it's taking what is a challenging idea, but explaining, well, actually by framing it this way and taking away, giving you less than what you thought you were expecting, we're actually going to gift you a whole lot more things. That is what we hope to bring through the design process.
That idea of communication is so important. So I understand. There is light and there is dark. Would you like to elaborate on how these influence your design thinking in a bit more detail? You touched upon it in the talk.
Look, it's they're not one or the other. Like, you can't have light without shadow. You can't have shadow without light. They are the same thing.
But you push the extremes, delightfully so, but perhaps you can explain further.
Yeah, I guess what we hope to shape, or what we hope to find in projects, is the quality of light, the qualitative, the shaping of light. And that means that, actually what we're looking for in that is the shaping of shadow. Because, one is the inversion, one is the negative form of the other. Spaces that we want to linger in, they have a definition, they have a presence, and part of that is, how you inform, how you, embrace or allow light or allow shadow to linger. It's not something we spoke about. When we started the practice, it feels like I'm copying Louis Kahn. It feels like I'm just taking, like, classical, it's about shaping light and it's shaping form. It's like, bollocks. We're doing all these other things, but actually, we're humans, we're kind of physiological beings. And we actually, we have a meaningful physiological calming connection to light and to shadow, and good quality light and shadow. So it's not kind of, academic fluff from mid-century. It's really meaningful.
I think also that just everyday life is full of light and shadow. You go down an alleyway and it's dark, or you go into like a rock canyon or whatever and it's dark, or you go out onto the beach and it's bloody bright. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about just general life when you think about architecture, and to allow all those kind of instances to kind of take place. Allow it to be bright where it needs to be bright, and allow it to be dark when you want to kind of recluse, whatever it might be. And then in an Australian context, I think it's the light typically is really, really harsh, and so I think you need a bit of a break from it. And so creating those spaces where you have a gradient of light is really important to living here, I think.
No, I think that's an important insight about real life, and how that should and could influence what we do. You care about country and have worked with Indigenous artists. However, your designs appear to absorb and reframe the essence of these things in a more abstract way. Would you like to comment on this?
When we began our practice, we were, aware that we worked on country, and we were aware that we worked in context. We've had such a pleasure and privilege to work with really good friends and incredibly generous creators like Ioane Scarce and Dan Boyd on a series of collaborations. And that's evolved, that's evolved the complexity of our thinking. It's been such a generous sharing of how we now think about, designing and working on country. But our projects have always, especially when they move from a from a private realm to a civic realm, we're really, I'll take a leaf, there's a phrase that David Adjaye would use as nation story building. When we're putting cultural, like libraries or contemporary art galleries or museums, these buildings have signifiers. They speak of story, and they speak of story to some and not to others. They're I guess the classical, the colonial heritage buildings of our past specifically speak of some stories and exclude others. And so having I guess having that presence or definition in a project allows the framing allows the self-awareness of what story making you might be involved with and how you might be enabling different sensibilities of cities to emerge over time, and being just an incredibly small, speck-like cog in that much, much larger wheel. But it's incredibly important that collectively, as architects, when we all work together, adding building by building in a city, there's a consciousness, awareness of the social fabric and the diversity of people who are being welcomed and included in that process.
I think that abstraction also helps, or that kind of condensation of an idea into something, or a complex idea into something simple and identifiable, also allows for that to read more clearly, or to kind of have a little more presence around it. And that notion of Indigenous community being able to see themselves reflected in the urban realm, in the built fabric of our urban realm, is really incredibly important. And so, yeah, that kind of clarity around those complex stories, I think, is helpful. I think in projecting a kind of sense of presence. Yeah.
The design for the larger building at Central Station in Sydney, you touched on it, but maybe in a little more detail. Can you explain how you've adapted your approach to work on that scale of building? That's possibly the largest scale of building you've worked on.
It's the largest scale of building we've worked on that we're allowed to show you. So, as we all do, we work in competitions, and there are things that are, in embargoes in various phases, and so we've had the great opportunity to work with some brilliant collaborative teams on some very large cultural projects across Australia. And that project, moving into that big commercial space, we had some wonderful mentors and supporters on the team. So Fender Cats, the leaders in SON, having some brilliant people just, supporting us, guiding us through that process. I mean, we started that. They'd already designed the buildings. They'd designed the podium, the towers, and City of Sydney, asked that developer to go out and seek, an emerging architect to come and work on this particular building. So we were starting from zero, and they'd finished. It was incredibly, not relaxing, really stressful and intimidating atmosphere to walk into. But it was just going back to, what is this building? What is Central Station in that area is. It is actually, it's a meeting place, or it's a point of entry from so many communities over, decades of, arriving in Sydney, of walking out and coming onto, into the city, into the big smoke. And it's a massive conduit of people. Thousands of people move across that site, from, Surrey Hills to, to Ultimo and back the other way. So that building was, I guess there's a phrase we've been using through the design process, the pebble in the pond. It was, being this clear, legible thing in the round that could enable thousands of people every single day to keep moving around that building, and be that marker point, that meeting point. When you come out of Central Station, I'm going to meet you by this building. There was so much complexity in that urban area that we needed that kind of, I guess, a silhouette of something clear and definable, that you could kind of, I guess a moment of quiet or clarity or formal quietude in that space is what we're hoping to achieve.
No, well, good luck moving forward. Tonight we've witnessed how you present together, crisscrossing each other's words. And I know that this afternoon you were sitting together at the hotel, working. So can you tell us and the audience in a little more detail how you work together?
Wow. Look, I think we started working together when we were in a different practice, and our relationship kind of grew out of a really open and robust critique. And are able to, I think, talk about projects in a way that we are really open, and we're not afraid of, pulling apart ideas quickly. And we kind of, in that early period of working together, we sort of developed a bit of a shorthand in terms of being able to describe ideas. And, it's developed over time. And I think that it's not precious in a way. So when things, good things come forward, then we can kind of really quickly move through them and clarify them. But importantly, I think we see things quite differently. And that sort of pulling apart of ideas and bringing them back together, as I think allows the idea to be strengthened in a way.
I think another friend, mentioned years ago that the greatest thing that they saw in the partnership was just the gift of editing, of having the two eyes looking across projects and actually being able to filter it down, refine it down until what's left is what needs to be there, and everything else, all the other extraneous potential ideas that actually don't belong, are able to be slowly kind of distilled out. That's what I think is the strength in the relationship. But the other half of that is, like any design collaboration or any relationship, is caring for that relationship. It's so important that we're busy, we've both got kids, there's so much on, that making sure that relationship is one that we come to with generosity and curiosity, rather than just the needs of the day or the needs of invoicing. You've got to care for these things.
Looking from the outside, it seems like that's pretty rare, and you've got a pretty special relationship going, so congratulations. No, seriously, and it's coming through in the work. There isn't, as you say, there's this editing process, and the projects get stronger through that, and that's really good. So,
yeah, I think it's fun. I think we like to have a bit of fun with it, and also I think there is a bit of speed associated with it, and we sort of germinate an idea for a while, leave it alone, come back to it. When we come back to it, it seems to kind of develop quite quickly. And I think that having two people looking at those things, as Kim was saying, it edits out quite quickly.
Yeah.
And allows us to
over those years to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think it's that shorthand which is really helpful. Yeah.
So then let's translate that to people that you work with. How does that work with your staff? How do you work with them? How do you work with the team?
Yeah, we've been developing something recently where we meet every Friday and talk about a project, whether it's a completed project or something that's on the books, and try and clarify these sorts of conversations, I guess, and how what the essence of the project is, in a way. So, and try and develop that shorthand with our staff through conversations around anything to do with detailing through to broader ideas, and hopefully try and convey that, allow the idea to be, or every kind of decision, I guess, reinforce that or amplify that idea behind the project. But
yeah, it's like any practice. We're 15 people at the moment, and so many projects exist within a small team. The project architect or a couple of people who are working on that project, and the same thing, skills, lessons learned. Things done right, things learned that weren't great. Relationship-wise, project management-wise, detail-wise, concept-wise. What we hope to do is flesh those out, get leaders within a practice to take the rest of the team through from an ideation point of view, how it might have gotten from an idea through to the built space, forum for the whole team on different scales and typologies of works. So it's trying to de-silo ideas and knowledge within the practice, both from ourselves, but also the leaders across the studio floor.
That idea of problems and things that have gone wrong is actually essential, critical.
No, and from our point of view, it shows in the work. You've been teaching these people, you've been refining what you do, and you're doing it well, so thank you. Perhaps a good point to end on. From my position as an observer, it's been a great pleasure to watch your careers grow. And I look forward to you continuing to design projects with intelligence, richness, and sensitivity. Aaron and Kim, thank you again for presenting the work of Addition Office to us today.
Our deepest thanks go to Stephen Varity, Kim Bridgland, and Aaron Roberts for an interesting and informative discussion this evening. We appreciate the time and effort that goes into preparing for events like this, and we hope everyone has enjoyed watching as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. We're excited to have recently confirmed an international guest who will feature in a series of talks in all of our Brickworks studios later this year. Head to our website, brickworks.com.au, to subscribe to events and ensure you don't miss an invite to this and more exciting events that we have in store. We'll see you next time. Good night.